And welcome to a special edition of Nostalgia Alley. We have a historian extraordinaire on our show, Phil Jaeger, who has written two books. First is Cedar Grove, and the second book is all about Montclair. And we have a lot of stuff to cover today. First of all, welcome to the show.
Nice
Good
to be
have you
here.
on, a big color cast.
Nice to be here.
And how did a retired math teacher from Millburn get interested in transportation? This is a fascinating hobby.
Well, it started probably in the late 1960s when my mother-in-law moved out to Warren County, New Jersey, out to Washington. And Jean and I, my wife, would go down to see her a couple times a month, and every time we went down there, we would take a different road, different route. And Jean and her mother and sisters liked to talk about family, and I sat there dutifully and listened for many an afternoon. And then on occasion, I would go out and do a little touring by myself, taking a little ride around the area, and I found out that in Warren County, there were remains of the Morris Canal, there were remains of the railroads that used to go through there. And that sort of started my interest in exploring New Jersey's history, and it's really started with the Morris Canal.
Yeah, tell us about that. That's a long forgotten canal.
Yeah, it is. What my appetite was, I got this as a Christmas present back in the 1960s, the Morris Canal, a pictorial history. And a friend of mine and I started to trace the canal, not walking from one end to the other, but over maybe about a dozen or 15 times doing various segments. And it dawned on me that it might be an interesting thing to compare the canal as it looked in the 1980s with how it appeared back around 1900. So I started taking pictures in the 1980s of the very same scenes that were in the book, being careful to match up the same building that existed then and now. And I turned it into a slideshow back in the 1980s with, thinking of the cameras in front of me, with two screens and two projectors, so that on the left was the Morris Canal as it appeared in 1900, and on the right as it appeared, say, in 1987. And I accumulated, I guess, maybe about 80 or 90 of these now and then photos, put them together with some research into a program, and it's a program that has been updated over the years.
And that was a main channel of commerce, right?
It was a main.
Way back. What year was that the main?
Well, it's the Morris Canal went from Phillipsburg to Newark originally. It was completed to Newark in 1831, 1832. There was an extension to Jersey City in 1836.
Really?
And it was around for almost 100 years. In 1924, partly because of the automobile coming in and the hazards with bridges for just one car. Bridges originally made for carriages and wagons, not meant for two-way automobile traffic. It was decided that the canal had outlived its usefulness, that it was a hazard. The water was drained, a lot of the structures were destroyed, but especially out in the western part of the state, there's still a lot to see.
And you have some pictures. Let's take a look at the
sure do.
What now and then, I guess, at the Morris Canal.
Okay, well, this is some of these are from my own collection of postcards, for example.
Okay, we're going to just hold that up like that.
Okay.
Now, this postcard is of.
That postcard is down in Stewartsville. It shows a canal boat by an inclined plane, and I guess what fascinated me about the Morris Canal, it wasn't just boats being pulled by mules, but there were a series of 23 inclined planes in the state that were water powered, that literally brought the canal boats up the mountains and also gently let them back down the mountains. In 1924, when the canal was abandoned, the inclined planes were dismantled, but there's still lots of remains, lots of traces of history.
So you're somewhat of an archaeologist, finding the remains of what was.
Absolutely. Especially with the Morris Canal, there's lots of.
Oh, you have some more pictures?
Lots of archaeology, sure do. This, I said my mother-in-law moved to Washington, and this is one of the inclined planes in Washington.
Okay, so we can get that. And maybe we'll look at a little bigger pictures, too. You have some great glossies, too.
Morris Canal in Washington, where my mother-in-law lived, that sort of whet my interest in the canal. And what I did, I brought about a half dozen or so.
Yeah, let's take a look at some of the big ones here.
All right.
Yeah,
This is, I think, very interesting because this is a town that has been much in the news in the last couple of months, namely Waterloo Village.
I know it well.
Which has lost its funding. It is closed. Hopefully it will be reopened this summer or this fall. But this is a picture of the Morris Canal in Waterloo Village with the church in the background and Lock Pond, which is part of the Musconetcong River that in a sense fed the canal in this area. So Waterloo is probably, not now because it's closed, but one of the best places in the state to still get a feel for what the Morris Canal was. There's the remains of a lock there. There's an inclined plane that goes up the hill, and lots of traces of the past.
Wow. I bet a lot of towns were built because of the canal.
A lot of the towns were built because of the canal. I find it interesting that out in western New Jersey, there's many towns that people use the words and may not realize what the origin of the words is. For example, places like Port Colden, Port Murray, Rockport, Port Morris in Morris County, and they were called ports because they were ports on the Morris Canal where the boats went through. So they're still called Port Colden.
Rockport. And nothing to do with the sneakers. Nothing to do with the sneakers.
Pardon?
Nothing to do with the sneakers,
no,
Rockport.
No, nothing to do with the sneakers. But there's still, even the names of towns still bear testimony to
another picture you have there?
To the Morris Canal. Sure,
this
is a somewhat interesting one. This is Lake Musconetcong. It shows the lock by the lake, and this was one of the places that when the canal was abandoned in 1924, the state deigned to leave some remnants of the past. So even though this is a current picture, you can still see the tops, the capstones of the stones that made up the lock up in the Netcong Stand.
A lot of the old buildings are still standing.
And a lot of the old buildings, a lot are gone, but a lot of them are still standing, which is what makes my slides are sort of interesting, is because you see the same building now,
right,
and the same building as it appeared.
Do you have a favorite building that's standing by the canal?
That's a really good question. I guess one of the places closest to home is in Mountain View, New Jersey, a place called Gabriel's Restaurant these days, that at one time was known as the Mountain View Hotel, and it hasn't changed much in 100 years. They have pictures of the Morris Canal in the lobby and such. Two more. This one is somewhat interesting because this is of Lake Apatcong, which was the major source of water for the Morris Canal. And back 100 years ago, Lake Apatcong was a great place for vacationists, tourists, day trippers. And they could get there either by a trolley, the canal, or a railroad. They went and stayed at the hotels around the lake.
Still a tourist attraction to this day, or not
less
so much?
A lot of permanent homes there these days. But Lake Apatcong in its day was, before the automobile gained widespread use, was a place to go. And I guess one of the last, I found this rather interesting.
Interesting here.
Interesting because you don't see the Morris Canal in the picture, but what you see in the picture is you see trolley tracks. You see an overhead bridge that was for a railroad. The Morris Canal went under the bridge, and I think in the photo there's a horse and a carriage. And the only thing that's left these days is the building that is in the picture that you see there. Everything else is gone, and when I went there to take the same picture, there's buses and cars, no trolleys, no railroads, no canals anymore. So, and that's sort of the end of the Morris Canal, because that's where its eastern terminus.
Now, actually,
eastern terminus was in Jersey City.
Wow.
But you mentioned sort of a string of things here. I started, my interest in the Morris Canal led me to collecting postcards. And I would go to postcard shows and I would look under the M's. And I would buy some Morris Canal postcards, but especially if there weren't a lot of cards, well, the M's were mixed together. So while I was looking for Morris Canal postcards, almost invariably I came up with postcards on Montclair. And that led me into a spree of buying Montclair postcards, which gave rise to that book that you had earlier.
Now, why the fascination of Montclair? What drove you to Montclair?
Well, I guess a couple of things. Number one, it is a town right next to Cedar Grove. Montclair had lots of transportation in it. It had a couple of railroads. The trolley went up Bloomfield Avenue in Montclair. And one of the things from a personal standpoint that got me somewhat interested was the fact that in 1986, my wife Jean and I moved into a house that was owned by Alan Dumont, who was originally a Montclair native, and Alan Dumont did research into cathode ray tubes.
Oh, yes.
He manufactured rather substantial television sets in the 1940s. Today, Channel 5 is the Fox network. Before it was Fox, I think it was Metro Media.
Mm-hmm.
And back, I guess in the 50s, maybe even the early 60s, I'm not sure, it was known as WABD for Alan B. Dumont. So the fact that we moved into a house that a somewhat famous television pioneer who was a Montclair native lived in sort of got me interested in Montclair,
all
along
the
with
old
the
shows,
trolleys.
Jackie Gleason
Show. Bishop Fulton Sheen,
of course.
I think was on WABD.
He certainly was.
I think Cavalcade of Stars was on WABD.
You know your history.
Yeah, there was it was sort of a big thing. So that's what got me interested in the in Montclair, and along with getting interested in the town itself, I got interested in the main drag through town, which is Bloomfield Avenue. And Bloomfield Avenue had a trolley that went originally from Newark all the way up to Caldwell, went through Montclair. It ran from the late 1800s up until 1952, and that sort of got me interested in trolleys, which is one of the slide programs I've come up with is something called Let's Ride the Trolleys.
Now, how did the name trolley get its name? We have 1 minute.
I believe, and I'm not that great on technology, but I believe the little wheel, the little roller that's at the top of the pole that's used to collect the electricity off of the hot wire, what was known as the trolley, and I think that gave rise to the Trolley Dodgers and eventually the Brooklyn Dodgers baseball team, which is what I liked, which is what interested me as a youngster and such.
That's terrific. Well, we're going to talk about a lot of other things.
All right.
We're going to take a little break right now.
Sounds great.
And when we get back, we are going to talk about castles. And castles are not only in storybooks, but they're also in New Jersey. So as I love to say, don't touch that dial.
We were in an emergency situation. We don't have extra. We have a little bit of water and a little bit of food. A meeting place, no.
No.
I don't think we have a first aid kit.
We have tuna fish, we have beans, we have canned tomatoes,
True.
you know.
That's true, but that's really not survival food. Tomato paste.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Listen, I know you're upset, but it was just one date. And dating's like the stock market. There's ups and downs and ups and... So always buy low.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of teens in foster care who would love to put up with you.
Welcome back, and as promised, we're going to talk about castles in the sky. First of all, it's amazing there are castles in New Jersey. You think of medieval times and not New Jersey necessarily.
Absolutely.
But how many castles approximately does Jersey have?
Well, I have my program on it has about a dozen castles, but I guess only about perhaps half of them still survive. A lot of them burned down, some were destroyed. Some still exist, but not so that you'd even recognize them. For example, the photo there is of the oldest castle I know, which is Becker's Castle. Was built out in Union Hill, which today I think is North Bergen and Union City, right in that area, perhaps on the border. But the castle was built in the 1850s, and I did some research and found out that it is in today's Bergen Hill. I called up the library, was told that it's possible that the castle had been transformed many decades ago into a crematory. So I went out there with camera in hand.
To go out there.
I went out there with camera in hand to the crematory, and the crematory certainly didn't look like the pictures of Becker's Castle. But I went inside. I spoke to the secretary there, and she informed me that it had become a crematory in the early 1900s.
Hopefully they didn't take reservations.
No, I don't know. Maybe they even had prepaying back then, as they do these days. You can prepay your funeral. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. In any event, back in the 1970s, they knocked the towers down, and they brick-faced the front, so it doesn't look like a castle anymore. But that's what Becker's Castle looked like.
Is the interior somewhat intact, or was it changed?
The interior is intact. What they've done is, in all the dining rooms and living rooms and things like that, is they've made small cubbies, small cubicles, where there are urns, pictures, letters from 1907, 1908 that still are there. They're there forever. But the inside is unchanged. Dark wood, somber, sober, very dark. But there are lots of castles. For example,
this castle here, this looks like a great castle.
This is a castle that still exists. It's in Rutherford. It was a castle that was built by a fellow by the name of David Iveson. He was a book company executive. He lived in Manhattan. This was David Iveson's summer house that he would come out to Rutherford with his horse and carriage and enter the entrance there, the porte cochere, and that's where he spent his weekends. The the castle still exists. It is now part of Felician College. It is their Rutherford campus. So there is an example of one that does exist.
Is there a moat around the castle where they throw to students if they don't achieve a certain
I don't know. I'm not sure. Not a bad idea. This is the largest castle in the state, and this is Lambert Castle.
Yes, I've heard it in Patterson.
And Lambert Castle in Patterson on Garrett Mountain with a marvelous view looking to the east of New York City. It is the home of the Passaic County Historical Society. It is a place where historical lectures are given, where antique shows are held, where there is a Christmas boutique every November.
Wow.
It's still a very, very active castle. This is, I found, one of the most fascinating. And we'll do these one at a time. There was a castle called Castle Edward, and Castle Edward was in Lake Apatcong. And people would get there, as I said before, with either the Morris Canal or trolley or railroad. But the Castle Edward was built as a resort, and I think it originally consisted of 20 rooms in the postcard there. But it proved so popular that those 20 rooms were soon expanded. They were soon doubled to 8 rooms. So now we have the same building that has been added onto Castle Edwards with 40 rooms.
Wow.
And then business was so big that they doubled it again.
Whoops.
They doubled it again, and now Castle Edward has 80 rooms. It was destroyed by fire, I think, around 1930. But by then, the automobile had become so popular, and Lake Apatcong was starting to lose its place as a destination for people in New Jersey because they could take their car or later fly other places.
So the largest castle probably in existence is the Lambert?
Is the Lambert Castle, and that still exists today. This not a castle, but this is rather interesting.
Oh, wow.
There's a fellow by the name of George Daner who came to southern New Jersey in 1928, 1929, just when the Depression was coming in. He bought himself some land, and he created what he called Palace Depression, not because it was sad, but because it was built during the Depression. He built it out of old automobile parts, mud, junk, trees, just anything he could get a hold of. And this is what George Daner's Palace Depression looked like when he was all done.
Yes.
It burned down, probably about 40 years ago or so, but there's a group in South Jersey that is recreating it, and they're trying, in a certain sense, to build it up the same way namely with, in this case, with cinder blocks, but with, again, a lot of junk, and they hope to reopen it sometime.
So some of it is left, and they're rebuilding on top of that?
Well, I don't know where the Palace Depression is left, but interesting in the postcard, if you see there's a little building that sort of looks like it has an antenna at the top, and that was the ticket office for Palace Depression. The ticket office is still there. The concrete benches are still across the street from it.
History.
That was Palace Depression. And the last topic, the last piece of history that I've finished, I have one in the works, has been the Passaic River.
Oh,
and this is, my interest in the Passaic has nothing to do with pollution or anything like that, but it has to do with history. So my wife and I, for the most part, myself singly sometime, have gone out and checked out many places along the Passaic River where there's still traces of history that exist. Passaic River is interesting. It's 81 miles long. It starts in Mendham as a little stream. It ends in Newark Bay. And while the Passaic River is 81 miles long, if you could fly from Mendham to Newark Bay, it would be about 26 miles. So the Passaic River really meanders all over the place. And this was...
And that's still pretty active, I mean, opposed to the Morris Canal.
Oh, absolutely. Not so much commerce, but even as far as recreation, there are one or two boat clubs that exist these days. There's a boat club out in Rutherford called the Nereid Boat Club. It has members. They use it for exercise, and it's also used by various high school crew teams that have their practice sessions out there. I live in Cedar Grove. Montclair is the next town from me. Montclair has a crew team, men and women, that uses the facilities in Rutherford, and they have a rather neat motto. The Montclair crew team's motto is NJ Packin' Back. And the idea is that they start in Rutherford, they go downstream to the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, and then they paddle against the modest current all the way back to Rutherford, which is why they have their motto, NJ Packin' Back. So that's a project that I finished, I guess, about a year ago. But the Passaic River, I've gotten an awful lot of pleasure out of. There are certain things that I think are quite interesting about the Passaic River. A couple of the prominent ones are...
Oh, wow, look at that.
And this is the Great Falls in Patterson. And the Great Falls in Patterson gave rise to America's first planned industrial city, namely Patterson, that used the waters of the Passaic River to turn the machinery in their mills. And this was Alexander Hamilton's idea back in the 1770s when he visited the area, and he thought, wow, this would be a marvelous way for us to move this country away from its dependence on England. We won't have to rely on them for manufactured goods if we could make our own, and his idea was to use the power of the river to make the goods. So
we need that today with oil prices going up, and
absolutely.
We need that type of thing.
Absolutely.
And that's still there, right? The falls are still
and the falls are still there, and it's still they have a Great Falls festivals there every Labor Day, and it's still a place where lots of
bridge is still
tourism.
standing too.
And the bridge is still standing.
Wow.
gives you a marvelous view.
Terrific. Definitely have to check that out.
Yeah, a couple other things that I found really of great interest is, for example,
Can't take that out. Oh, just hold that
the
up.
Passaic River goes under the Pulaski Skyway.
Oh, it does. I drive it every day back and forth.
Do you?
from
Okay,
work.
and the Pulaski Skyway has been in the newspaper lately as a roadway, a skyway that is past its prime.
Yes,
and
indeed.
They're thinking of someday, I'm not sure whether they're going to create one parallel right next to it or what have you, but the Pulaski Skyway is getting rather old. It was built in the early 1930s, and it was not originally called the Pulaski Skyway.
Oh, it wasn't?
It was called something else, and what it was called the Diagonal Highway. And it was called the Diagonal Highway because the side view of it has all these diagonal braces that gave rise to the name the Diagonal Highway. And it's a slideshow that I've given quite a few times recently. And the last time I did it, I said to the audience, how many of you know who demolished the Pulaski Skyway back in 1938? And a couple of people said, gee, I didn't think the Pulaski Skyway was demolished. I'm sure it's still there. And I said, well, I said it was demolished, and somebody then spoke up, and I said, I know who demolished it. Orson Welles demolished it on Halloween Eve in 1938 in his broadcast War of the Worlds.
Oh,
and
yes.
the Martians came with their laser guns, and they vaporized the Pulaski Skyway. And that's sort of the one thing that really stuck in my head about the Pulaski Skyway is that it was a major factor in Orson Welles' War of the Worlds.
That's why I see those little green men running across the Pulaski. I always wondered what that was.
There you go. There you go.
My wife says to me every day, please don't drive the Pulaski Skyway.
It's dangerous. There's no shoulder. No shoulder. So those are the projects that I've done in the past. My current one, I'm not sure I'll ever be finished with it, but my current one is ghost signs of New Jersey.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
These signs that have faded over the years but point to industries, businesses that are long gone, theaters that no longer exist. For example, back, I guess, through the 1950s or so, 1960s, Newark had many movie theaters. And I think there's maybe only one or two left. None of the old ones are left.
Yes, I know.
But still on the sides of buildings, you see, for example, if you look up RKO Proctor's, for example, so the signs are still there. A lot of these establishments are gone. But this is my my current project is ghost signs.
So that's another book in the horizon?
Well, maybe a program, maybe a book. There's a fellow that has written a book on ghost signs in New York City, and New York City is a great place for it because there's so many buildings. And whenever they knock a building down, all of a sudden the ghost sign from 100 years ago gets revealed for the first time in decades. But he photographed hundreds of ghost signs in New York City and categorized them by the type of business, haberdashers or whatever it might be.
You don't hear that name anymore.
No, you don't hear that, but it's sort of traces of the past.
Wow. Actually, we're running out of time. I can't believe we covered everything that we covered in a half hour. It's pretty incredible.
Okay,
but a couple of things that you wrote, which is, of course, Montclair and Cedar Grove. Now, how do people get a copy of this?
The Montclair book should be available at Barnes & Noble or Borders or Amazon.com. The Cedar Grove book is out of print right now, but the Montclair book can be gotten at either of those bookstores or Amazon.com. And eBay is a possibility for the Cedar Grove book, even though it's out of print. If you go on eBay and you put in Cedar Grove, you're more than likely to,
Terrific.
half the time at least, come up with that.
And then we're going to put your email address if people want to contact you for a lecture or two. This is an incredible thing.
That is my kind of thing these days.
That's great.
Sure, that would be great.
Well, Phil, I want to thank you for being on the show.
All right.
It's fascinating. We learned a lot of history today.
Okay.
And we want to thank you for tuning in, and I'd like to say good night to you, and especially to you. Thanks, Phil. Terrific show.
Knowledge is not we should be taught to dance. Right here, a tape, we're up to date. We teach a great